Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Let's drift into a soothing story together as you begin your journey into a restful and rejuvenating sleep. Under the heavy gray sky of a cold Scottish morning, the small village where Alan lived remained silent and still. The rolling hills, draped in mist, loomed like silent giants, watching over the land as they had for centuries. Alan, a young and determined farmer, slowly rose from his creaky, worn-out bed. The room, as modest as it was cold, held the faint scent of damp stone and hay. The weathered window offered only a glimpse of the world outside, but it was enough to remind him of his daily struggles. His gaze lingered on the land he worked, a land that had once promised hope, but now seemed to mock him. The soil, though, rich in history, yielded little for his family. Every year, the crops came up sparse, the fields never fully meeting the demands of survival. Alan's heart sank every time he stepped onto the land, feeling the weight of a future that seemed as barren as the fields he tilled. What once felt like a future filled with potential now felt like an endless cycle of hardship. His fingers, stiff from the chill, touched the window pane. The morning fog was thick, and the cold air slipped in through the cracks in the walls. The mist seemed to swallow the landscape, obscuring the peaks of the distant mountains and making the world feel even smaller and more isolated. The land, vast and endless, now seemed like a prison rather than a place of opportunity. Yet Alan knew he had no choice. This land was his birthright, his family's inheritance, and it was here that he had to fight for every scrap of life. The wind howled against the walls of his home, and the scent of rain mixed with the damp earth. He could feel it, the weight of years spent in this place, fighting for survival, and the quiet desperation that gripped him. His father had passed away many years ago, leaving Alan to care for his mother and younger siblings. There was never enough to go around, never enough food, never enough warmth. They had long ago learned to endure the hardships, but even the strongest of wills could wear thin over time. Alan sighed deeply, feeling the full weight of his role in this struggle. Every day, he woke to the same reality, the endless cycle of labor, the threat of famine, and the ever-present shadow of hunger. His family's survival depended on his work, and yet it seemed that no matter how hard he tried, the land would never reward him as it should. The harder he worked, the more elusive prosperity became. It wasn't just the barren fields. The very structure of society seemed designed to keep people like him trapped in an endless loop of poverty as he stared at the land. Alan's mind wandered back to the many winters he had endured. The cold months when the wind cut through the thin walls of their cottage, the fires barely enough to warm the air, and the nights seemed longer than the days. The constant struggle to find enough food to feed his family during the harshest months had become a part of their rhythm. Like the turning of the seasons, relentless and unforgiving. Is there no way out? He thought to himself. He looked out over the fog-covered hills, but there was no answer. Only the vastness of the land and the weight of his responsibilities stared back at him. He had come to understand that survival wasn't just about working hard. It was about enduring the harshness of life without letting it crush your spirit. But even the toughest hearts had their breaking points. His thoughts shifted to his family, his mother, Always so strong, so determined, yet growing weaker with each passing year. And his younger siblings, who looked to him for guidance, for protection, and for hope. Alan knew he had to be their strength, but the burden was a heavy one. The question that gnawed at him every day was not how to survive, but how to escape from this cycle of poverty that seemed as inescapable as the mist that blanketed the land. He turned away from the window, feeling a resolve growing inside him. His father had worked the land and his grandfather before him, but Alan was different. He couldn't accept that this was all life had to offer. He had seen glimpses of a different life, heard stories from travelers who spoke of lands where the sun was warmer, the soil richer, and the opportunities greater. But those lands felt like a dream, far away and out of reach. Still, something stirred within him, an unspoken promise that he wouldn't let fate decide his future. "I will change this," Alan whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the howling wind. He knew that breaking free from the chains of his circumstances would not be easy. It would require more than just hard work. It would require something greater: courage, wisdom, and the willingness to challenge everything he had known. But for the first time in years, Alan felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but the possibility of a different life, one where he controlled his fate, had begun to take root in his heart. The wind picked up outside, howling through the cracks in the walls as Alan walked away from the window, his mind still heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He knew the world outside wasn't waiting for him to make a decision. It was a world where life moved relentlessly forward, where the rich grew richer and the poor became even poorer. He had seen enough of the suffering around him, families like his, struggling day after day, enduring not just the cold, but the suffocating weight of the system that kept them in their place. Alan's heart beat faster as the thought took root. What if there was another way? What if he could change everything? The voice, now quieter but full of intent, reflects: the weight of a man's decisions is often not in what he chooses to do, but in what he dares to dream. Alan had lived his life according to the same rules that had governed his fathers and his grandfathers before him. But in that moment, standing in the shadows of his cold cottage, something stirred in him, a yearning for a life that was not defined by the land, by scarcity, or by a family history bound to the earth. With a sigh, Alan glanced at his mother, who sat by the hearth, stitching a patch into a worn coat. Her hands, though weathered with age, moved with steady, practiced grace. She had been the heart of their family, holding everything together when Alan's father had passed away. But her strength was no longer enough to sustain them, and Alan knew it. The look in her eyes, tired but full of love, always made him feel as though he couldn't afford to fail. "I'll do what it takes," Alan murmured, almost as if he was making a vow to himself. "I can't go on like this." He stepped outside into the damp, early morning, the ground beneath his boots soft and wet from the previous night's rain. The world outside was quiet, save for the chirp of a few early birds and the rhythmic flow of the nearby stream. It was the same landscape he had walked through his entire life, but today it felt different. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as though the winds themselves whispered of change. Alan began walking toward the edge of the field. where the land sloped downward toward the distant woods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. He knew what lay ahead of him, more of the same toil, more of the same back-breaking work with little to show for it. But today, he wasn't just thinking about survival. He wasn't just thinking about the endless struggle for enough food or firewood. Today, Alan thought about escape, the possibility of freedom from the cycle that had trapped his family for generations. As he walked, his thoughts turned to the stories he had heard from travelers passing through the village. They spoke of lands to the south, where the soil was rich and the weather warm, where farmers worked with tools that made their labor easier, not harder. They spoke of cities with markets brimming with goods, of opportunities for people like him to forge their own paths. For the first time, Alan allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the endless fields. He had never thought of leaving before. It was always a dream he thought was too far out of reach. But now, with every step he took, the idea became more real. The voice, now gently guiding, adds, change is not just about escaping from something, it's about moving toward something. And Alan's heart, though heavy with the burden of responsibility, began to beat with the hope of a different life. He wasn't just seeking freedom from the land that had bound his family for generations. He was seeking a future filled with possibility, a future where he could decide his own fate, not one that had been written for him by the cycles of nature and poverty. Alan's resolve grew stronger as he continued walking, moving deeper into the trees. The thick forest around him seemed to embrace him, the cool air filled with the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. There, in the quiet sanctuary of the woods, Alan took a deep breath, letting the stillness wash over him. For the first time, he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and determined. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about change, and in that moment, Alan knew he was ready to act. Alan continued his journey through the woods, each step taking him deeper into the embrace of the forest. The landscape, once a symbol of oppression, now seemed to offer him a rare opportunity for clarity. The trees whispered softly in the wind, their leaves rustling as if urging him forward. For the first time in his life, Alan felt that the world was not something that simply happened to him. It was something he could shape, something that could be transformed if he found the courage to act. His thoughts were no longer just about survival. They had shifted into a new realm of possibility, one where freedom could be achieved through action, through challenging the very structure that had oppressed his family for generations. He knew the risks, of course. Leaving the land behind was not an easy decision, and rebellion, in whatever form it took, was dangerous. But the fire of possibility burned bright in his chest, and he couldn't ignore it. He thought of his family, of his mother's tired eyes, and his siblings who had always depended on him. How could he continue to accept the life that had been forced upon them? The thought of a different life kept him moving forward, each step more resolute than the last. The voice, now soft yet filled with urgency, continues. Rebellion doesn't always come with the clash of swords or the roar of armies. Sometimes it begins quietly in the mind of one person as a seed of doubt. Alan had carried that seed for years, but today In the quiet solitude of the forest, that seed began to sprout. It wasn't just a desire for freedom. It was a yearning to break free from the very chains that had bound his family, that had shaped their lives, their choices, their futures. Alan's mind raced as he walked. He thought of the village, its people, his neighbors who shared in the same hardships. They too were trapped in the same cycle. It wasn't just his family. It was everyone. They were all bound by invisible chains, held by the land, the laws, and the overwhelming power of the church and the nobles. Alan had always accepted this as his reality, the way of life he'd been born into. But now, in the stillness of the woods, he couldn't help but question everything. What if the system that kept them all down could be challenged? What if they could fight back not with weapons, but with knowledge, with unity, with a determination to break free? His thoughts drifted to the stories of rebellion, the whispers of those who had fought for freedom. Some had failed, their names lost to history, but others had succeeded, carving out a space for their people, creating new paths where none had existed before. Alan wasn't foolish. He knew the risks involved, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this moment, this decision, could change everything. It wasn't about whether he could survive. It was about whether he was willing to live for something more. The voice continues, its tone growing more determined. In that moment, Alan realized that the greatest act of rebellion was not to fight the system head on, but to refuse to accept the life that had been imposed on him. It was the refusal to let destiny dictate his future. Rebellion, true rebellion, began with a single act of defiance, the decision to dream of a better life, to act on that dream, and to take control of his future. The path ahead was unclear, but Alan no longer felt lost. His mind was filled with purpose, each thought a stepping stone toward an unknown future. He thought of his mother again, her quiet strength, her tireless devotion to keeping the family together. He had always felt a deep sense of responsibility to her and his siblings. But now, his responsibility had shifted. It was no longer just about keeping them alive. It was about giving them something more. It was about giving them hope. The voice, now filled with quiet reverence, says, "Hope, like fire, can spread." Alan's decision was not one made lightly, but it was a spark that had the potential to ignite something far greater. It wasn't just his future at stake, it was the future of his family, his village, and perhaps even the world he had known. As Alan continued his walk through the forest, the ground beneath his feet felt firmer, the air around him fresher. It was as if the very earth was acknowledging the shift inside him. With every step, he moved closer to his destiny, and the uncertainty that had once plagued him began to feel like a distant memory. The road ahead was unknown, but it was a road he was ready to walk. As Alan ventured further into the forest, the air grew cooler, and the deeper he walked, the more his thoughts consumed him. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by the rhythmic tapping of his boots on the damp earth and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. For the first time in a long while, the quiet gave him space to think without the weight of the world pressing down on him. Every step now felt purposeful, a journey not just into the woods, but into the unknown future he was carving out for himself. The voice continues, Quiet yet powerful, the road to change is not easy, and the cost of rebellion can be high. But Alan, in his newfound resolve, knew that he could no longer stand idly by. He had tasted the bitter fruit of subjugation for too long, and the injustice of it all began to eat away at him. But he also knew that the path of resistance was fraught with peril. Change, real change, would come at a price. Alan's mind drifted back to the village, his neighbors, his friends, the people who worked beside him day after day, enduring the same trials. They were all stuck, like him, in the endless cycle of poverty, their hands bound by the land, by the laws, and by the ever-tightening grip of the nobility. But unlike Alan, most were too afraid to speak out, to question the system. They had been conditioned to accept their fate as inevitable. They were afraid of what would happen if they stood up against the powers that controlled them. The voice softens, carrying the weight of this realization. Not everyone has the courage to stand. Not everyone can see the chains that bind them. The fear of what might be lost, of what might happen if they fight back, holds many in place. Alan was not like the others. His courage came from the knowledge that doing nothing was worse than facing the consequences of rebellion. He had already lost so much. There was nothing left for him but the chance to change his fate. Alan's footsteps slowed as he approached a clearing in the woods. The trees here were older, their trunks thick with age, their branches reaching high into the sky like arms stretching toward the heavens. In this moment of peace, Alan stopped to catch his breath. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was from the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Would he go back to the village and continue to live as he had before, beaten down by a system that had never cared for him or his family? Or would he take the leap, risk everything for the chance at something better? As he stood there, the quiet of the woods enveloped him, and Alan knew that there was no going back. He would need to gather the courage to speak out, to rally the others who shared his plight. It wasn't just about breaking free for himself, it was about setting an example for others. If they could see his strength, maybe they would find the courage to rise up too. But even as this resolve burned inside him, Alan felt the weight of the decision. Rebellion would not come without sacrifice. If he stood up, there would be consequences. The nobles, the church both would make sure that any dissent was crushed. But the thought of a future where his children, his family, and his people could live freely, without the suffocating grasp of the elites, was too powerful to ignore. The voice continues with gentle intensity. The cost of rebellion is not just the pain of the present, but the uncertainty of the future. Alan was about to make a choice that could change his life forever. He could lose everything, his land, his family, his place in the village. But in the end, what he would gain was more valuable than anything he stood to lose. Freedom, a future where he could shape his own path, free from the chains of the past. Alan stood still for a moment longer, taking in the weight of his decision. The forest around him seemed to grow still, as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting for him to act. He knew what he had to do. It was time to return to the village, to speak to those who were willing to listen, to bring them together. He could not wait any longer. The dream of freedom burned bright inside him. and he could not let fear hold him back. The voice reflects, almost as a final nudge. In the silence of the forest, Alan's decision was made. He was no longer the boy who had accepted his fate. He was now a man determined to fight for something greater. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and risk, but the promise of a better life for himself and those he loved was enough to ignite his soul with the fire of rebellion. With one last look at the clearing, Alan turned and began the walk back to the village, the burden of his decision heavy but also liberating. He was no longer walking toward an uncertain future. He was walking toward the possibility of a better life, one that he and his family would fight to create. As Alan made his way back to the village, the path seemed longer, the journey heavier, as though the weight of his decision was pressing down on every step. His mind raced with the enormity of what he had just committed to. He could no longer return to the life he had known. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. His heart, once full of doubt, now beat with the steady rhythm of purpose. The village, nestled in the valley below, looked peaceful from this distance, but Alan knew better than anyone that beneath the calm surface, turmoil was bubbling. It had always been there, waiting for a spark. The voice speaks, soft yet filled with gravitas. The path of change is never an easy one. Alan could feel it now, the burden of leadership pressing on his shoulders. What had once seemed like a distant dream now stood before him as a harsh, undeniable reality. The question was no longer whether he could bring about change. It was whether he had the strength to see it through. As Alan descended into the village, he passed familiar faces, people who had lived beside him for years. Their tired expressions mirrored his own. They too knew the struggles, the hardships, the long hours of labor under the relentless rule of the nobles. They knew the suffocating grasp of the church, the promises of salvation that never came. But none of them had ever dared to question it. Alan had always been one of them, and yet he felt a growing distance now, a separation that had begun the moment he had decided to change his life. He was no longer just a part of the village, a cog in the wheel of its daily struggle. He was something more now, something different. He was a man who dared to dream of a better life, a man who was about to set that dream into motion. The voice reflects thoughtfully. To change the world, one must first see it clearly. Alan had spent years looking at the village, at the people around him, seeing only the struggles, the hardships, the endless cycle of labor. But now he saw something else, a spark of potential, a possibility for freedom. This vision, once just a faint idea in his mind, had taken root in his heart, and there was no turning back. Alan's thoughts drifted back to the rebellion, the gathering of others who shared his discontent. The movement was small, fragmented, but growing. He had spoken to a few people, trusted friends, a few like-minded villagers who understood the weight of the situation. They had agreed to meet in secret to discuss a plan, to figure out how to break the chains that bound them. But Alan knew that words were no longer enough. The time for action had arrived. The voice continues, its tone becoming more deliberate, as though guiding Alan's thoughts forward. There comes a time when the words are no longer enough. Words are the foundation, the spark that ignites the fire, but it is action that turns dreams into reality. Alan understood now that it was not enough to merely speak of change. He would have to lead it. He would have to fight for it with every ounce of his strength, even if it meant risking everything. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting a golden hue over the village, Alan felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. He could feel it in his bones, the power of what was to come. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, not just from the nobles, but from the people themselves. Fear was a powerful force, and many would hesitate, unsure whether the risk of rebellion was worth the cost. But Alan knew one thing for certain: he could not do this alone. He needed the support of those around him, the people who were ready to fight for something better, for a future where they were not slaves to the land or the whims of the ruling class. The voice speaks softly, almost a whisper, as though urging Alan on. You are not alone, Alan. You never have been. There are others who think as you do, who dream of the same future. You will find them. You will lead them. Together, you will change the course of your future. With renewed determination, Alan walked into the heart of the village, his resolve solidified. It was time to speak up. It was time to bring his vision to life. The rebellion wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered, about everyone who had been forced to live in silence. This was their chance to be heard. This was their chance to fight for a better life. A voice, now firm with conviction, concludes, Alan's journey had only just begun. The storm was gathering, and with it the chance for change. It would not be an easy road, but it would be one worth traveling. He was no longer just a farmer in a village. He was a leader, a man who would fight for his people, for his future, and for the freedom that had long been denied to him. As the village embraced the quiet of the night, Alan's heart beat louder than ever, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. Knowing that the first step toward change had been taken, the evening sun cast long shadows across the village as Alan stood in the center of the village square, the familiar sights of home now appearing distant and foreign to him. His heart beat steadily, but his mind raced, running through the words he needed to say, the strategy he had so carefully crafted in his mind. He had walked into the village with a sense of purpose, but now that he was here, standing in the middle of it all, the enormity of what he was about to do began to sink in. The voice, now soft yet urgent, murmurs, change comes not when the moment feels perfect, but when the courage to act outweighs the fear of failure. Alan had never been one to back down from a challenge, but now he was about to face the greatest test of all, the challenge of changing not just his own life, but the future of his entire village. And for that, he would need more than just determination. He would need the support of those around him. Alan's thoughts shifted to the small group of villagers who had agreed to meet with him in secret. They were the ones who had dared to dream alongside him, the ones who had listened when he spoke of a future beyond servitude and subjugation. They shared his hunger for change, but even they were nervous. The idea of rising up against the nobles, against the powers that controlled their every move, was daunting. The fear of retaliation, of losing everything they held dear, made them hesitate. But Alan knew that their hesitation was not weakness. It was the burden of fear, a fear that he, too, had carried until now. The voice continues, emphasizing the shift in Alan's mindset. Fear is a natural response when facing the unknown, but it is also a signal. A signal that something powerful is on the verge of happening. Alan had felt the weight of that fear for years, but now he understood something. Crucial fear wasn't something to avoid, but something to face head on. The fear of losing everything was the very reason he had to act. Without it, nothing would ever change. And so Alan steeled himself for what was to come. He gathered the small group of villagers in a quiet corner of the village, away from prying eyes. The flickering light from a single lantern cast shadows on their faces, but Alan could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that had once held him captive. But beneath the fear, he saw something else, a spark, the spark of hope, the possibility of something greater. They were ready to listen. The voice grows stronger, with a sense of anticipation. The quiet of the night was broken by the murmur of voices, the sound of lives on the brink of change. These were the first steps of resistance, the first sparks of something larger than any one person. Alan's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of what he was about to do. His words would become the catalyst for action, and every person in that small circle would become part of the movement that would change the course of their lives forever. Alan took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "We've lived like this for too long," he said, his voice firm. "We've accepted the life we were given, believing it was our fate. But it doesn't have to be this way. We have the power to change things. Together, we can stand against the nobles, against the church, against the systems that have kept us down for generations. We are not slaves to the land. We are not slaves to them." The villagers listened in silence, their eyes wide, their breath held. Alan could feel the weight of the moment. For some, it was the first time they had ever considered the possibility of change. For others, it was a long-held dream that had finally found a voice. The voice, now full of quiet power, continues. Every movement begins with a single word, a single act of courage. Alan had spoken those words, and now they hung in the air, charged with possibility. The people around him were no longer passive recipients of their fate. They had become part of something greater, something that could reshape their world. Alan could see the shift in their eyes, the glimmer of something, knew something bold sparkling behind the fear. It was a spark of defiance, a defiance against the life they had been told was inevitable. Slowly, one by one, the villagers began to nod, their resolve strengthening. "I'll follow you," one of the older men said, his voice quiet but firm. "We've always been afraid, but if we stand together, perhaps we can change our future." Alan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. The seed of rebellion had been planted. It was small, fragile, but it was there, taking root in the hearts of the people who had once felt powerless. They were no longer just victims of their circumstances. They were becoming agents of their own future. The voice concludes softly, almost as if to himself, rebellion is never easy. It is a long, winding road full of uncertainty and sacrifice. But in that moment, Alan realized that this was not just the beginning of his fight, it was the beginning of a revolution. The first spark had been lit, and it would spread, slowly but surely, to every corner of their world. As the villagers gathered their courage, Alan could sense that they were ready to move forward. The road ahead would not be without obstacles, but they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Alan allowed himself to believe that a better future was possible, that change was not just a dream, but a reality waiting to unfold. As the days passed, the air in the village seemed to hum with a quiet energy. The seeds of rebellion, once a whisper in the hearts of a few, began to grow stronger. Alan had spoken those first words of defiance, but now it was time to make them real, to turn the dream of freedom into tangible action. He could feel it in his bones, the growing strength of the people who had joined him. The villagers were no longer just survivors of their fate. They were becoming the architects of their future. But the road ahead was not going to be easy. The voice, slow and deliberate, muses, change is not born in the comfort of inaction. It is forged in the fire of resistance, in the quiet determination of those who are willing to risk everything for the chance at something better. For Alan, this was the first test, the test of turning words into deeds and courage into reality. Alan spent his days quietly organizing, gathering information, and planning. He knew that they needed more than just the will to fight. They needed strategy. The nobility wouldn't simply allow them to rise up without retaliation. He had learned through his own hardships that the system would not crumble easily. And so he sought out those who had experience, those who knew how to move in the shadows, how to navigate the treacherous waters of rebellion. There were whispers in the village of allies, men and women who had escaped the bonds of feudal servitude. They were scattered across the land, hiding in the corners of society, waiting for the moment when they could rise up. Alan knew that if they were going to succeed, they would need to unite these forces to gather the strength of not just the villagers, but of the entire region. The rebellion had to be more than just a local movement. It had to become a beacon for all those who had suffered under the weight of the aristocracy. The voice, growing softer yet more insistent, adds rebellion, is not born from the hearts of the few. It is born from the collective will of the many. Alan understood now that his fight was not just for his family or his village, but for the countless others who had never known the taste of freedom. He could feel the weight of their hopes, their dreams, resting on his shoulders. Alan's first move was to reach out to the neighboring villages. He needed to create a network of trust, a network that could support them when the time came to strike. But the challenge was immense. The nobles controlled the land, the law, and the resources. They had spies everywhere, their eyes and ears, lurking in every corner of the village, watching for any sign of discontent. Alan had to move carefully, cautiously. One misstep, one slip of the tongue, and everything could come crashing down. One evening, after a long day of planning, Alan sat by the hearth with his closest allies, a small group of trusted villagers who had already proven their loyalty. Their faces were drawn, tired from the weight of their labor, but their eyes were sharp, filled with the same fire that burned in Alan's chest. Together they formed the core of the resistance, each one offering their knowledge and skills to the cause. The voice, now filled with a quiet intensity, continues. In the stillness of that room, Under the flickering light of the fire, Alan saw something that was more powerful than any weapon or army: unity. It was in the way their hands rested on the table, in the way they exchanged looks, each one willing to sacrifice for the future they dreamed of. They were no longer just individuals struggling to survive. They were part of something larger, something that could change their world. But despite the growing strength of their movement, there was still a palpable fear that hung over them. Alan knew that to succeed, they needed more than just the willingness to fight. They needed the courage to withstand what was coming. He had no illusions about the difficulty of their mission. The nobles would fight back. The church would condemn them. The road ahead would be paved with obstacles, each more dangerous than the last dot. The voice softens, almost like a whisper, as though urging Alan forward. There is a moment in every revolution, in every act of defiance, when the weight of what lies ahead feels unbearable. It is in that moment that one must decide: will they continue, even knowing the dangers, or will they retreat? Alan had come this far, but the greatest test was yet to come. As the fire crackled and the room grew warmer, Alan looked around at the faces of those who had chosen to follow him. His heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. These were the people who would change the course of history. These were the ones who would help him build a new future. The voice, now filled with quiet conviction, concludes: Alan had taken the first step, and now the path was clear before him. The rebellion would rise, not just in the shadows of the night, but in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better future. And together, they would stand against the forces that sought to keep them in chains. As the days turned into weeks, the rebellion began to take shape. The secret meetings continued, the plans evolving and solidifying with every discussion. Alan had gathered a small but dedicated group of villagers, each of whom brought their own skills and knowledge to the table. Some were farmers like him. Others had once been traders or craftsmen, all of them experts in different aspects of village life. They worked in the shadows, careful not to draw attention to themselves, but their collective energy was palpable. Every day, the movement grew stronger, and Alan's resolve grew with it. But with every passing day, the tension increased. Alan had known from the start that the nobles would not let their power slip away quietly. They were entrenched in the land, and their grip on the people was firm. The church, with its far-reaching influence, had already begun to watch Alan and his group closely. Whispers had spread through the village, rumors of unrest and rebellion. It was only a matter of time before their plans were discovered. Alan had known this from the start, but now, standing on the precipice of action, the weight of what was to come was more tangible than ever. The voice, soft yet filled with urgency, reflects: change is never easy. It's a dangerous road, one filled with obstacles and risks. But in the quiet of the night, as Alan sat alone with his thoughts, he realized that the true danger was not in the rebellion itself, but in the consequences of doing nothing. He had been living in fear for too long. Fear of retribution, fear of failure, fear of what might happen if they were discovered. But it was that very fear that kept them trapped. And now Alan had to decide whether to move forward, to embrace the unknown, or to retreat into silence, allowing the status quo to continue. Alan's thoughts drifted to his family. His mother, who had never asked for anything more than a life free of struggle, and his younger siblings, who had always looked to him for guidance and protection. His mother had never been one for rebellion. She had always taught him to accept their place in life and do what was necessary to survive. But Alan had changed. The seed of rebellion had taken root in his heart, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. His family had suffered enough. They deserved more than this life of hardship. With these thoughts weighing heavily on his mind, Alan stepped outside one evening, the cool night air pressing against his skin. The village was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of the moon. The sounds of distant animals and the rustling of leaves in the wind were the only noises that broke the silence. It was the calm before the storm, the stillness before the chaos that would inevitably follow. Alan knew that when he took this step, there would be no turning back. The rebellion would either succeed or fail, but it would change everything. Voice, gentle but firm, continues. It is in the quiet moments that decisions are made. Alan stood in the silence of the night, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he also felt something else, a sense of power. The power to change the course of history, to take in control of his future, and to give his family and the people of the village a chance at something better. Alan knew the risks. If the rebellion failed, the consequences would be severe. The nobles would retaliate, the church would condemn them, and they would be hunted down. But Alan had already accepted that there was no future for him or for his people under the rule of the elites. The fear of retribution no longer held him back. What was worse, living in silence, knowing that they could never break free, or fighting for a chance at something greater, even if it meant risking everything? His heart beat faster, not with fear, but with determination. Alan had come to understand that the cost of inaction was greater than the cost of failure. The voice whispers, almost as if to himself, to change the world, one must first change themselves. Alan had transformed from a farmer into a leader, a man who would not accept the fate that had been handed to him. And in that transformation, he had found his strength. With a deep breath, Alan turned back toward the village, his decision made. It was time to act. The movement would no longer be confined to whispers and secret meetings. It was time to bring the fight to the very heart of the village, to make the nobles in the church see that their power was not absolute. Alan had found the courage to lead. Now, he would take the first step, knowing that the future of his people rested on the choices he made in the coming days. The night was still, but Alan's heart raced with the anticipation of what lay ahead. He had made the decision to move forward, to begin the process of rebellion that would change his life and the future of his village. The moment of silence in the woods had marked the end of hesitation, and now he was ready to face whatever came next. There was no turning back, no retreating into the comfort of the life he had known. The world outside would either bend to their will, or they would rise up and take what they deserved. As Alan walked back toward the village, his mind was filled with the sound of his own thoughts, a constant hum in his ears. He had spoken the words of defiance, but now the true test would begin putting those words into action. He had spent weeks gathering support, quietly speaking to trusted villagers, convincing them that they had the power to change their fate. But now, as he entered the village square, Alan knew that the time for secret meetings was over. They needed to act, and they needed to act quickly. The voice speaks with quiet intensity. The first act of rebellion is always the hardest. It is the moment when everything you've dreamed of collides with the reality of action. Alan knew that once the spark of resistance was lit, there would be no turning back. This was no longer a dream, it was a fight for survival. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences would be profound. Alan approached the center of the village, where a group of his closest allies had gathered. They were waiting for him, their faces a mixture of determination and anxiety. It was one thing to speak of rebellion in secret, but it was another to take that first step in full view of the village. The stakes had never been so high. Alan felt a sense of unity in their presence. He wasn't alone in this fight. They had chosen to follow him, and together they would stand against the forces that had kept them in poverty for so long. One by one, Alan met their eyes, offering a nod of reassurance. These were the people who had been with him from the start, the ones who had heard the whispers of rebellion and chose to stand by him. There was no turning back now. The villagers who had joined him would have to face the same risks, the same dangers. Alan's role was no longer just that of a leader. He was now their guide, their protector, their beacon of hope. If the rebellion failed, it was not just his family that would suffer. It was everyone who had dared to dream of a better life. The voice reflects, as if echoing Alan's thoughts, a leader is only as strong as those who follow. Alan had gathered a group of villagers who, despite their fear and uncertainty, had chosen to stand with him. They understood the risks, but they also understood that the alternative, living under the crushing weight of their oppressors, was no longer an option. The plan was simple, though dangerous. The villagers would begin by striking at the heart of the nobles' power, disrupting their supply lines, sabotaging their ability to control the village. Alan knew that this wouldn't be an immediate victory. The nobles were powerful, their resources vast, but every act of defiance, no matter how small, would weaken their grip. The first action would set off a chain reaction, a ripple of resistance that would spread throughout the land. Alan spoke to the group, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Tonight, we take the first step. We may not have the strength of an army, but we have something more powerful, the will to fight for our future. This is our chance. If we do nothing, nothing will change. But if we act, we can change everything. The villagers nodded, their faces hardening with determination. They had already made the choice to stand, and now there was no going back. The plan was set, the stakes were high, and the risk was undeniable. But in that moment, as Alan looked around at the people who had gathered to fight by his side, he knew that they had something more powerful than any army. They had the strength of unity. The fire of hope. The voice, now filled with quiet power, concludes, the first act of rebellion is not about victory, it's about courage. The courage to stand, to fight, to take that first step into the unknown. Alan knew that this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but with each action, they would weaken the grip of the powers that held them captive. This was their fight, This was their moment. The night seemed to hold its breath as Alan and his group moved into position. The world around them was still, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. The future was uncertain, but Alan no longer felt afraid. He felt the power of his decision coursing through him, and he knew that they would not be defeated, not as long as they had the courage to fight. The night was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the promise of change. Alan stood at the forefront of his small group, their movements silent and deliberate, each person aware of the weight of the task ahead. It was a crisp, moonlit evening, and the village was still, the sounds of life muffled by the thick fog that rolled in from the hills. The only noise was the rustling of leaves in the wind, the steady thump of boots on the wet earth, and the quiet whispers of those around him. The voice, now calm yet filled with tension, begins. Every revolution begins with a single act of defiance. Tonight, it was not about grand speeches or the clashing of swords. It was about quietly challenging the established order, taking a step that could not be undone. Alan knew the risks. But what was the price of silence? What was the cost of inaction? For Alan, the answer was clear: freedom was worth everything. Tonight, they would make their stand. Alan's heart was heavy, but his mind was focused. They were targeting the supply storehouse of the local nobles, a symbol of the wealth and power that had been built on the backs of people like him. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but it was one that would send a message, that they were no longer willing to be passive participants in their own oppression. The plan was simple: to disrupt the supply lines that fed the nobles and their army, to send a signal that the people were rising up. The storehouse, though guarded, was vulnerable at night, and Alan had chosen this time for its quiet, to slip in unnoticed and do the damage needed. The first step was critical. If they succeeded, it would ignite something larger. If they failed, they would risk everything, but Alan had no doubt in his mind. This was their moment. The voice, now steady and powerful, whispers, "Fear is a constant companion on the road to rebellion." But courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act in the face of it. Alan had feared this moment, but he had come to realize that fear was simply a part of the journey. The greatest act of defiance was not in challenging the power of the nobles, it was in challenging the power of fear. The group made their way through the fog, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, each footstep deliberate and silent. They reached the outskirts of the noble's estate, the dim light of the moon reflecting off the stone walls that surrounded the supply storehouse. The guards were few, stationed in predictable places, allowing Alan and his group to slip by with ease. This was the moment they had prepared for. Everything they had done had led up to this one single act. Alan's breath caught as they reached the entrance. There, just beyond the iron gate, stood the storehouse. It was not a grand building, but to Alan, it symbolized the very system that had kept his family and the village in servitude. His hands trembled as he took out the small key that would open the gate. This was it, the beginning of something that could either tear them apart or free them. As the gate creaked open, Alan motioned for the group to follow, the first of his companions stepped forward, moving with a grace born of necessity while the others followed. Alan felt the weight of each step, but there was a growing sense of resolve within him, a sense that the moment had arrived, that the choice he had made was finally being brought to life. They reached the supply rooms, where sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, and stacks of firewood were stored. The nobles' abundance, the fruits of exploitation, lay in front of them. Alan's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the realization that they had the power to take it back. They had the power to disrupt the flow, to show the world that they were no longer powerless. The voice, quiet yet commanding, speaks again. In that moment, Alan understood what it meant to take control of his own fate, not through violence, not through grand gestures, but through quiet acts of defiance. The rebellion did not begin with grand speeches or bloodshed. It began in the silence of the night, with a simple act of choice to fight for something better. They worked quickly, cutting the ropes that bound the sacks of grain, spilling the contents across the floor. Barrels were overturned, their contents splashing across the stone, disrupting the flow of supplies. It was a small, simple act, but it was enough to send a message. Enough to show that they were not afraid anymore. When the work was done, Alan paused for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The warehouse, once a symbol of the nobles' wealth and control, was now a scene of chaos, empty sacks scattered across the floor, grain spilling out like the power the nobles had hoarded for so long. Alan stood there for a moment, his breath steady, his heart still racing. The voice whispers, as though guiding Alan's thoughts. This was the beginning, a small act, but a significant one. The first strike had been made. The rebellion had been ignited, and with each act it would grow. The road ahead would not be easy, but tonight, Alan had taken the first step toward freedom. Alan signaled for the group to leave, and they exited as quietly as they had come, their hearts pounding with the thrill of their success. They had made their mark. The rebellion had begun dark as Alan and his group made their way back to the village. Under the cover of darkness, the weight of their success began to settle in. The sounds of their footsteps seemed to echo through the silent night, and with each step, the reality of what they had just done grew more profound. They had struck at the heart of the nobles' control, taken their first action in a larger rebellion. It wasn't just about the supplies they had disrupted. It was about sending a message to everyone who had been too afraid to act, too afraid to question the life they were living. The voice speaks, steady and filled with anticipation. Hope is a quiet thing sometimes. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It lingers in the shadows, like a soft flame waiting to ignite. Tonight, Alan and his group had not only disrupted the flow of supplies, they had ignited a spark that would spread, slowly but surely, as the rebellion grew stronger. For the first time, Alan felt something inside him that he had not felt before: pride, and more importantly, a growing sense of belief. They had done it. The first act of rebellion was a success. But as they moved back through the village, Alan's thoughts grew darker. They had disrupted the nobles' power for now, but what would come next? The nobles would retaliate, of that he was certain. Their actions would not go unnoticed. The forces they had defied would strike back harder than ever, and Alan knew they would need to be ready. The voice, a little softer now, reflects his thoughts. The path of rebellion is never linear. It is full of uncertainties, filled with unexpected turns and dangers. Alan had made the first move, but the real challenge lay ahead. The nobles would not let this act go unpunished. The question now was whether the rebellion could survive what was to come, and whether Alan, as its leader, had the strength to face the inevitable challenges that would follow. Alan's mind swirled with thoughts of the future. What would happen when the nobles sent their soldiers to the village? What would happen if they were caught? The repercussions of their actions could be severe, not just for Alan, but for everyone who had chosen to follow him. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him, but there was something else beneath it, the flicker of hope. The people were waking up. They were beginning to see that there was more to life than endless toil and servitude. There was the possibility of freedom, of a life that was not dictated by the whims of those in power. As Alan entered his small cottage, his mind still racing, he found his mother sitting by the hearth, her face soft with worry. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes softened with the same quiet concern that had always been present in her gaze. She didn't say anything, but the weight of the unspoken question was clear. What had he done? What would happen next? Alan walked over to her, his heart heavy with the burden of his decision. He had known the risks, but now that they were so real, the fear was undeniable. He had put everything on the line, and there was no going back. The voice, now filled with quiet reflection, asks, what is the price of rebellion? What is the cost of challenging the system that has bound you for so long? Alan had known that the road would be dangerous, but now, standing before his mother, he felt the full weight of what he had done. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but he knew something else, too. The path they had chosen was the only one that could lead them to freedom. His mother didn't speak, but the silence between them was filled with understanding. She had seen his struggle, seen the weight he carried, and now she understood the choice he had made. She had always been his strength, but Alan realized now that it was his turn to be her strength. The rebellion was no longer just about him. It was about them, about his family, about the future of their people. He couldn't turn back, not. Now, as Alan sat beside his mother, the fire crackling in the hearth, his mind turned back to the village and the people who had joined him. They had taken that first step, but they were not yet free. There would be more steps, more actions, more sacrifices. Alan knew that they would face obstacles both from the nobles and from the people who were too afraid to act. But he also knew that the dream of freedom, once planted, couldn't be easily extinguished. The voice concludes, softly but with resolve. Rebellion is not a battle fought in a single night. It is a long and arduous journey, a journey that begins with one act of courage, one spark of defiance. Alan's rebellion had only just begun, but already the world around him had begun to change. The fire had been lit, and no matter what happened next, it would continue to burn. The days that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation, a sense of something monumental lingering just beneath the surface. Alan could feel the weight of his choices in every breath he took, in every glance exchanged between the villagers. The first act of rebellion had been successful, but that success came with a cost. The nobles would not let this go unchallenged. and Alan knew that they were already preparing their retaliation. The people of the village, once timid and fearful, had begun to stir, but would they have the strength to continue? Would they have the resolve to face what was coming? The voice, soft yet steady, continues. In times of change, there is a quiet before the storm. The first act of rebellion has its consequences, and the real battle often begins in the heart. Alan had crossed the threshold into something unknown, something that would shape not only his future, but the future of his people. But what lay ahead was not a single battle, it was the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. Alan stood by the window of his cottage, gazing out at the village. The mist was thick in the early morning, swirling like the uncertainty that hung in the air. The land, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed full of potential. The quiet before the storm was not one of stillness. It was a time of waiting, of preparing for what was to come. Alan knew that soon the nobles would come for them, but he also knew that the rebellion was no longer just his burden to bear. The villagers were with him. They had chosen to stand up for something greater, to risk everything for the chance at freedom. He turned from the window, his resolve hardening. It was time to rally the villagers again. The fire had been lit, but now they had to fan the flames, stoking the embers of rebellion into something that could not be extinguished. Alan had become more than just a symbol of resistance. He had become the leader they needed. His heart pounded with the weight of what lay ahead, but there was no turning back. The spark they had ignited could not be put out. The voice continues, speaking with gentle urgency. The future of the rebellion depended not just on Alan's leadership, but on the unity of the people who followed him. He had given them hope, but now he had to give them something more: the courage to face the challenges ahead, the strength to fight for their future. He was no longer just a farmer. He was their guide, their beacon in the dark. Alan's thoughts returned to his family. His mother, sitting by the hearth, had always been the pillar of his life, and now, with his heart heavy with the weight of his decisions, he realized that his role had changed. He was no longer just her son, seeking refuge in her comfort. He was her protector now, just as he had promised himself long ago. He had to lead this rebellion, not just for his own freedom, but for hers, for his siblings, for the future they deserved. As the days turned to weeks, Alan's resolve grew stronger. He had become a different man than the one who had walked into the woods, unsure of his future. Now, his mind was filled with strategy, with plans for the future. He knew the risks. He knew that the nobles would fight back, that the church would send its forces to stamp out the fire of rebellion. But Alan also knew that their fight wasn't just for survival. It was for something far greater. It was for freedom, for a life where they could make their own choices, where their futures would not be determined by the whims of the elite. The voice, soft but filled with resolve, reflects. The journey to freedom is long and fraught with peril, but it is a journey worth taking. Alan had stepped onto this path, and now there was no turning back. His journey had become something more than just his own fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever felt the weight of oppression, for everyone who dreamed of a better life. And in that fight, Alan found something more than courage. He found the strength to lead. Alan stood tall, a quiet sense of power settling over him. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for a future that he believed in, a future where his people would not be bound by the chains of the past. He turned back to his companions, his allies, the people who had stood by him from the very beginning. The time had come to act once more. The first act of rebellion had been a spark. Now, it was time to turn that spark into a fire that would burn through the oppression and light the way to a new future. The voice concludes with quiet strength. The rebellion had begun. The road ahead was uncertain and the risks were high. But Alan and his people were ready. Together, they would rise. Together, they would stand against the forces that sought to hold them down. And together, they would shape a future that belonged to them, a future of freedom, of hope, of the possibility of something better. Alan's heart beat steady and strong as he stepped forward. The journey had only just begun, and there was no turning back. But for the first time in his life, Alan felt something powerful surge within him, a sense of hope, of purpose, of a future that he could shape. He was ready to lead, and the rebellion would grow.